I actually would like you to draw a little bit further on the Ritchie, just because I find the Ritchie might be a bit overwhelming for the students, and we are challenging the students by presenting them with a range of different kind of theoretical backgrounds, and I think it's useful for them to think about that. But the Ritchie, as a feminist particularly, is quite embedded within the Foucauldian notions of power control, and how the state can control bodies through institutions of health, and particularly controlling the reproduction, or reproductive health, and in that way controlling women's bodies. And in some ways, what Ritchie is trying to show is to turn that argument on its head, to say that for women in Tanzania, they find almost solace or support through the institutions of, within the healthcare system, which informs their choice as to why they would use that. And it's really interesting because it's about this issue of choice, and that choice is contextual. Could you perhaps just give us a little bit more detail around perhaps the framing of this paper, and how we might think in a nuanced way around this idea of choice?
I'm so glad that you've asked me to say a few more words about this, Stephen. I think the students will find this a very challenging piece because it's not written from the perspective of public health, epidemiology, or health systems. This is a scholar who has a sociological and anthropological background, and she came to her field work in Tanzania with a lot of reading about the use of contraception and fertility control globally over the last 100 years as a way for patriarchy, by which we mean older generations of men attempting to control the fertility, the sexual lives of younger people, including and especially women. And she looked at that and traced that in literature through Europe, through, for example, the Christian churches, through the rise of Western medicine and then biomedicine, and through the efforts in the 1920s through to the 1970s of, on the one hand, extreme right-wing regimes in Brazil, in Germany. People will know about the National Socialist State or Nazism, in Italy, in the United Kingdom, in Eastern Europe, what was then called the USSR, in China, in India, and in many African countries, including South Africa, to control people through biomedicine. What the very, very famous, now deceased, sociologist and philosopher of medicine from France, Michel Foucault, described as biopower. And in the wake of Michel Foucault's work, including his famous book called The Birth of the Clinic, which is the idea that clinical medicine itself becomes a very powerful arm of state control over human society and human freedom, she then works through the feminist scholarship that took that up, particularly in the area of reproductive health, of obstetrics. Now, the students in this course have not been exposed a lot to that philosophical approach, because you usually find that in anthropology, history, philosophy, sociology, political theory departments. But we chose this reading because what happens is that Ritchie has read that literature. She comes to Tanzania, and she's also reading the literature that the Tanzanian government, that Tanzanian NGOs, that Tanzanian embedded gender groups are offering about why they are trying to make a surge towards providing easily accessible contraceptives to Tanzanian people. And in the first phase of Tanzania's post-independence under Julius Nyerere, there was this conception of African solutions for African problems. And there was a huge rejection of Western methods, as it was considered to be, Western methods of population control. But the Tanzanians began to observe the work of India and of China and of other developing countries in the southern hemisphere of the world, and they began to reconsider their view in the late 70s that all forms of hormonal population control were Western inspired and were negative. And so there's a quiet revolution that went on in Tanzania over the period of about 25 years. And in that space were also voices that bubbled up from inside of Tanzanian civic society. And this included Tanzanian versions of gender equality arguments. And because so many contraceptives had actually been banned in Tanzania, what began to happen is there was a huge struggle in Tanzanian society as people moved to highly urbanized, market economy-based ways of living, when women wanted to have at least 10 years, if not 12 years of education. And they began to search out ways, as women had in China, India, France, England, the United States, Australia, Brazil, Cuba. They began to search out ways to control their fertility, to extend their period of secondary and tertiary education, and to negotiate decision-making around conception inside of their partnerships. And as Richie shows, things are not all equal. You do not have a simultaneous equality in society guaranteed. There are unevennesses. People may have more power in one domain of their life than another. And what Richie says, in this complex space, it's Tanzanian women themselves that began to argue for an extra set of technologies that they could draw on. And as Tanzanian women qualified as nurses and as doctors and as clinical scientists and went into the population and health programs of the Tanzanian government, so the idea that Depo-Provera or other injectable or other hormonal contraceptives were all bad or evil began to get more contested. And what you have is that by the early 2000s, and in the last 15 years or so, gradually, the Tanzanian government began to open up to the idea of hormonal contraceptives. And she did very finely grained interviews with people on the ground, with people in rural areas, with poorer Tanzanian women, and with stakeholders, many of whom are professional Tanzanian women in their 30s and 40s who'd been educated in the last 10 or 15 years. And she found a much more complicated set of questions about why Depo-Provera should still be a part of the repertoire of choice, and how, in fact, biopolitics theory could be turned on its head. And you could have actually a very strong feminist argument for Depo-Provera in Tanzania today. That's why we included that complex and lengthy argument, so the students could test their own capacities and their own thinking in that space. And it's quite nice, Stephen, to have it on a country that's not our own, so we can observe a society that wasn't heavily affected by settler racism, which has a very small community of people who have an origin in Europe, and where, yes, there are different ethnic groups in Tanzania, and there are different religious groups, and all of these complexities are in our article, but you do not have the sort of heavy burden of the apartheid state playing its way through her theory. And so I think it's a very useful thinking text for the students.